Hi, this is Ken from the Educational Engineering team. This course is all about getting started with Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi came around when I truly needed it, nearly a decade ago. I was actually bored and burnt out on technology, but figuring out the Raspberry Pi, it actually renewed my appreciation of computers. Now, Linux was frustrating to learn, and as well as this Raspberry Pi. But at the same time, it reminded me of editing the autox.bat and the config.sys files as a kid. I spent an entire day downloading and compiling the first software I found to turn the Raspberry Pi into a game console, only to discover that it didn't work. Now, this roadblock led to days of troubleshooting on writing deadline before I finally fixed it. And today, I'll be teaching you on how to get started with Raspberry Pi. And at the end of this course, you'll be surprised because you will be able to learn on how to make amazing cool projects at the end of this video. So, are you excited? Let's head on to our first topic. Again, in this project, you will able to connect a Raspberry Pi computer and find out what it can do. Now, it is important to take note that this guide is an introduction to the Raspberry Pi computer. Now, there are also detailed guides to setting up your Raspberry Pi and using your Raspberry Pi. Now, Raspberry Pi is a low-cost credit card-sized computer that plugs into a computer monitor or television, and it uses a standard keyboard and a mouse. It is capable of little device that enables people of all ages to explore computing and to learn how to program in languages like Scratch, Python, and it's actually capable of doing everything you'd expect a desktop computer would do. Now, from browsing the internet and playing high-definition video and to making spreadsheets and word processing, and even playing games. What's more, the Raspberry Pi has the ability to interact with the outside world, and it has been used in a wide array of digital marker projects, from music machines and parent detector to weather stations and tweeting birdhouses with infrared cameras. And we want to see the Raspberry Pi being used also by kids all over the world to learn to program and understand how computers work. Now, what you will make today is the Raspberry Pi is a small computer that can do a lot of things, and you can just plug it into a monitor and attach a keyboard and a mouse. So basically, in this course on getting started with Raspberry Pi, you will be able to learn on how to use basic digital, analog, and electromechanical components. Now, additional also informations for educators: if you need to print this project, you can just print the friendly version of this course. So, what will you need along this course? First is the hardware. You would be needing a Raspberry Pi computer with an SD card or micro SD card. Also, you would need a monitor with a cable. Now, this is optional. An HDMI adapter is also cool. You would also need a USB keyboard and mouse, as well as a power supply, of course. Also, headphones or speakers. Now, this is optional, as well as the Ethernet cable. Now, for the software, you would need to have Raspberry Pi OS and installed using the Raspberry Pi Imager. So, go ahead and prepare these things before we proceed. Now, I want you to meet the Raspberry Pi. Meet the Raspberry Pi 4. Now, you're going to take a first look at the Raspberry Pi, and you should have a Raspberry Pi computer in front of you for this. So, as I've said, you need to prepare the program in your computer. Now, look at the Raspberry Pi, and here you can find all the things that is labeled on the diagram. We have the general purpose input and output pins. This is for connecting electronic components. Then we also have the Ethernet ports. Then we also have, below it is the USB ports. Then below the Raspberry Pi diagram, we have the auto jack, we have the camera module port, we have the HDMI ports, we have the micro USB power, And we also have the micro SD card underneath here in the left side. So what are these parts? So the uses of this, first we have the USB ports. Now USB ports, now they are used to connect a mouse and keyboard, and you can also connect other components such as a USB drive. For the SD card slot, now that is used to insert the SD card there, and this is where the operating system software and your files are being stored. Then we also have the Ethernet port earlier, right? Now that is used to connect Raspberry Pi to a network with a cable. The Raspberry Pi can also connect to a network via wireless LAN cable. We also have the audio jack. Now the audio jack, as we all know, can be used to connect headphones and speakers here. Then you have observed for the HDMI port. Now this is where you connect the monitor or projector that you are using to display the output from the Raspberry Pi. And if your monitor has speakers, you can also use them to hear sounds. Then we also have a part there on the micro USB power connector. Now this is where you connect a power supply, and you should always do this last after you have connected all your other components. Then lastly, we have the GPIO ports, and this allows you to connect electronic components such as LEDs and buttons to Raspberry Pi. So now I'll be teaching you on how to do or how to use the Raspberry Pi step by step. So make sure on your end that you have ready your Raspberry Pi software or your computer for you to follow me hands-on. So again, what is a Raspberry Pi and where is it being used? Now the University of Cambridge Computer Library is using the Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi decline in skill level. It is designed for education. It is a credit card size PC. It is being plugged into a television or computer or any monitor. And Raspberry Pi is actually inexpensive. It is around $35 each. It has a good capability as well as programming and electronic projects and an office, and it can play high definition videos. For the kit components, for the Raspberry Pi, the essentials would include the Raspberry Pi board, the prepared operating system SD card, the USB keyboard, the display with HDMI, DVI, or composite input. Then another essential is the power supply. For the highly suggested extras would include USB mouse, internet connectivity, LAN cable, powered USB hub, and a case for protection of your Raspberry Pi. For the programming languages, the Raspberry Pi Foundation recommends Python, any language which will compile the ARM version 6 that can be used, and installed by default on the Raspberry Pi. We have the C, we have the C++, we have the Java, which I believe is quite familiar to you. We also have Scratch, and lastly we have Ruby. So Raspberry Pis in the primary education. You can just watch this link for a better explanation on the Raspberry Pi being used for the kids out there. So what are the main 10 uses for a Raspberry Pi? The 10 is the programming. Raspberry Pi programming is the process of using code to create programs that run on Raspberry Pi devices. Programs that can be written in a variety of languages, including Python, C++, and Java. Raspberry Pi programming allows developers to create projects that interact with the physical world, such as controlling motors or sensing environmental conditions. It can be used with Python and Scratch. Raspberry Pi is actually a way to create software for the Raspberry Pi computer, as I've said, for Python programming language, and actually Python is a widely used high-level interpreted language that is very perfect for beginners. And Scratch is a visual programming language designed to help kids to learn on how to code. The 8th is Raspberry Pi as a game console. Raspberry Pi game console is a device that allows users to play video games on their television. Now it is a small, low-cost computer that is designed for hobbyists and tinkerers. The Raspberry Pi game console uses a program called emulation to play old video games from classic consoles like Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Next is we have the web server. Raspberry Pi web server is a computer that hosts a website. It is typically a small, low-cost device that can be used to provide internet access or a host website. Raspberry Pi web servers are popular among hobbyists and small businesses because they're inexpensive and easy to use. So again, Raspberry Pi can be used as a web server, especially you can use the Apache HTTP server. Raspberry Pi can be also used as a TOR router. Raspberry TOR router is actually a device that uses TOR software to route traffic through the TOR network, and this can actually provide increased privacy and security when browsing the internet. It can also be used to access blocked websites and content, and a Raspberry Pi TOR router is a configuration of the Raspberry Pi microcomputer that allows it to function as a wireless router that uses TOR to anonymize the internet traffic. Now, this setup is particularly used for protecting the privacy of users who are concerned about their online activity being tracked and monitored. Now, the TOR or the Tor network is a volunteer-run network of servers that bounce traffic around in order to conceal the user's location and identity. Raspberry Pi can also be used as the HTTC. Now, this is actually a library that allows you to make requests to websites using the Python programming language. It can be used to scrape websites for data or automate tasks that would otherwise require manual input. So Raspberry Pi HTTC is a device that allows users to connect to the internet using a wireless network adapter. It can also be used as a server to provide services such as web hosting, watching Netflix, and even watching the BBC player, and many more. Then another use for Raspberry Pi is that you can use it as the birdhouse. The birdhouse is a project that uses a Raspberry Pi to automate the process of feeding and watering the birds. The project consists of a Raspberry Pi, a water pump, and a feeder, and a water reservoir. The Raspberry Pi is used to control the water pump and feeder and to monitor the water reservoir. When the water level in the reservoir falls below a certain point, the Raspberry Pi will activate the water pump to refill it. So the birdhouse is a device that is designed to attract the birds. It is made out of Raspberry Pi. It is a small computer and a few other components. The Raspberry Pi birdhouse can be programmed to play different types of bird songs which will attract birds to the house, and the house has also a built-in camera which can be used to record the birds that visits the house. Raspberry Pi can also be used as a supercomputer. Now, supercomputer in a Raspberry Pi is a computer that uses several Raspberry Pi boards to create a powerful system. Now, this type of computer is often used for complex tasks that requires a lot of horsepower, such as scientific, research data, or data analysis. By using several Raspberry Pi boards, a supercomputer can be created for a fraction of the cost of traditional systems. So the Raspberry Pi is a small computer that was designed for educational use. However, it can also be used as a supercomputer by connecting multiple Raspberry Pis together. It is possible to create a powerful computer that can be used for tasks such as data processing or scientific research. Another use for Raspberry Pi is being used as a clock. Raspberry Pi is a digital clock that uses Raspberry Pi as its main component. The Raspberry Pi reads the time from the internet and displays it on a screen or in another format. So the Raspberry Pi clock is a digital clock that is designed to be used with the Raspberry Pi computer. Now the clock is based on the DS1307 real-time clock or the RTC chip, and it can be used to keep track of time even when the Raspberry Pi is turned off. Now, the clock can be configured to display in a variety of formats, and it can also include a built-in alarm clock.